The white steeple of Snowpine Church rose against the gray November sky like a prayer etched in wood, its bell quiet, its doors open to the sound of morning. Inside, every pew was filled. Men sat stiff with hats in their hands, women clutched handkerchiefs pressed to their lips, and the sound of the hymn drifted through the rafters as if carried on smoke from the wood stove near the altar. The town had gathered to honor their dead, sons and brothers buried under flags in faraway fields, husbands whose names were carved into stone though their bodies never returned. The air was heavy with grief, with the weight of loss that seemed too vast for one building to hold. The doors opened then, and the sound of the hymn faded like a candle snuffed too soon. Every head turned, and silence spread through the church like frost across a window pane. Hannah Whitfield stood in the doorway, her figure framed against the pale light of the snow beyond. She wore ivory satin, creased but clean, the seams yellowed with age, yet unmistakably a wedding dress. The bodice stretched across her full figure, the skirt brushing against boots damp with slush. In her gloved hands she held a single lily, its white petals trembling in the draft that followed her inside. Her chin was raised, her eyes fixed straight ahead, every step measured, every echo louder than the hymn that had just ended. Whispers stirred like dry leaves caught in a sudden wind. Is that her wedding dress? Has she lost her mind? Ursie, look at the size of her. She is making a spectacle. The words cut sharper than knives, though most were meant to be hidden behind palms. A laugh rang too loud from the back pew, high and mocking. Well, the woman smirked. Who is going to tell her she is pretty now? The ripple of laughter that followed was thin and cruel. Hannah felt each sound pierce her skin, felt her cheeks flush beneath the veil of composure she forced herself to wear. Her breath caught in her chest. Her heart beat fast and heavy, but she did not stop. She thought of James, her late husband, who had once kissed her hand in this very church, who had called her lovely with a smile that made her forget the stares of others. He had chosen her once, and that memory was all she had left. If she kept her head high, perhaps they would see her not as a woman mocked, but as a widow who still belonged to love. She reached the front and laid the lily at the altar, where the names of the fallen were written on slips of paper pinned to the wood. For a moment she stood there, her shoulders rising and falling, with the effort of holding back the tide of shame that pressed against her. The whispers behind her did not fade. They scratched at her ears, pricked at her heart. She turned, her steps as slow as they had been on the way forward, though now her hands trembled beneath the gloves. The cold met her the moment she stepped outside, the wind sharp against her flushed skin. Snow gathered at the edge of the porch, crunching under her boots. She drew in a breath that stung her throat, and only then did her eyes blur with tears she had refused to let fall inside. She leaned against the rail, her chest tight, her shame raw and heavy. She had wanted only to honor the man she had loved, but the world had chosen laughter over reverence. The white dress that once marked joy had become a banner for their ridicule, and as she stood in the snow, the loneliness pressed harder than ever, though a small part of her whispered that dignity sometimes needs only one witness to survive. The wind cut sharp across the churchyard, lifting the hem of Hannah's worn satin dress and carrying the sound of muffled laughter still spilling from inside the wooden walls. She gripped the porch rail with one gloved hand, her breath clouding in the bitter air, her chest rising fast as though she had run a mile. The lily she had carried to the altar drooped in her other hand, its pale petals bruised and cold, and she could not bring herself to look back at the doors. They had mocked her, each whisper and smirk slicing into her heart until she could no longer stand beneath the roof where her husband's memory rested. The white dress, once a symbol of joy, now felt heavy on her shoulders, like a foolish costume she should never have dared to wear. She pressed her lips tight, willing herself not to cry, not here where they might see through the windows and laugh again. The wood beneath her fingers was rough. The air smelled of smoke and pine, and the snowflakes that clung to her lashes melted with the heat of shame burning across her cheeks. She wanted to disappear into the storm, to let the wind carry her away where no eyes could judge her. "I saw what they did," a voice said, low and steady, breaking through the cold silence. Hannah startled, spinning toward the sound. A man leaned against the porch beam, tall and broad-shouldered, his hat brim pulled low against the wind. His coat was buttoned to the throat, snow dusting the edges, and his face was calm, almost too calm, as though nothing surprised him anymore. Weston Dyer had been there all along, hidden in the shadow of the church, watching the way she had walked with her head high, while the others laughed. Her breath trembled in her chest. "I just wanted to honor him," she whispered, voice catching, eyes fixed on the ground. Weston nodded once, his gray eyes steady. "You did," she shook her head. They laughed. They always laugh. "They don't know better," he answered simply, not with pity, but with a firmness that carried no room for argument. From his coat pocket he drew a folded handkerchief, white with frayed edges, and held it out to her. He didn't move closer, only waited, his hand steady in the cold. Hannah hesitated, then reached for it. The fabric was warm from his pocket, and she pressed it quickly to her eyes before she could stop herself. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice barely more than a thread. His gaze did not shift. "Because everyone deserves to be seen with respect, especially when they're grieving." The words struck her harder than the laughter had, not because they were grand, but because they were plain truth. He was not pitying her, not mocking her, simply seeing her. She clutched the handkerchief in both hands, her heart unsteady, and whispered, "I thought maybe wearing the dress would remind them I was once loved." Weston's voice was quiet, gravel wrapped in gentleness. "It reminded me." Her head lifted then, just enough to meet his eyes. For the first time since she had stepped into that church, the burning weight in her chest eased, just slightly, as if one man's steadiness had been enough to keep her from crumbling. Snow swirled around them, the cold still biting, but inside her, something warm began to stir, fragile but alive, like the flicker of a flame refusing to go out. The snow had thinned into a light dust that morning, drifting over the rooftops of Snowpine and settling soft against the wagon wheels that lined the street. Hannah walked with her shawl drawn tight, her steps slow on the frozen boards of the porch outside the store. The echoes of laughter from the church still haunted her ears, though she had tried to push them away. She had not planned to see Weston Dyer again so soon, yet there he was, standing beside his horse, near the hitching post, his broad frame outlined against the pale sky. He was speaking low to another rancher, his hat brim tipped forward, but when his eyes lifted and found her, he straightened, and his voice quieted, as if the world had shifted without warning. Hannah felt her cheeks heat under the cold wind. She meant to pass by, to keep walking until the snow swallowed her up, but Weston tipped his hat with a slow nod, not as a greeting from a stranger, but as if he had been waiting for her. She stopped, unsure why her feet betrayed her, unsure why she could not simply turn away. The silence stretched, broken only by the stomp of his horse's hooves. "You heading anywhere after this?" Weston asked, his voice rough but even, like a man unused to filling silence with idle talk. She clutched the basket at her side and shook her head slightly. "Nowhere that matters," she said, surprised by the honesty of her own words. His eyes lingered on her face, steady and unreadable. "I run a place north of town, Hollow Ridge. Too much work for one man, and too quiet for a child to grow up alone." He paused, his hand brushing the horse's mane. "I could use someone steady around the house." Hannah blinked, her breath catching. "You want to hire me?" she asked, her voice thin. Weston's mouth pulled into the faintest line, not quite a smile, not quite stern. "I want to offer you a place," he said. "Work that means something, not out of pity, out of need." She hesitated, her fingers twisting around the handle of her basket. "But I am not," she faltered, her throat tight. "I am not what people think of as useful. They laugh at me, always have." "I'm not looking for pretty or perfect," Weston said softly, cutting through her words. "I'm looking for someone who knows how to stand when it would be easier to run. I saw you do that." Before Hannah could answer, a small voice chimed from behind him. "Daddy." A girl no older than 7 came running, her curls bouncing, her cheeks bright from the cold. She stopped beside him and looked up at Hannah with wide eyes that sparkled like bits of amber in the snowlight. The child tugged at Hannah's dress, and grinned. "Pretty lady," she said without hesitation. The words knocked the breath from Hannah's chest. No one had spoken them to her in years. She crouched down, her hands trembling as she reached for the girl's small fingers. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Isla," the girl said proudly, her smile wide and certain. Hannah glanced up at Weston, her heart thudding. The world seemed to still for a moment, the snow falling gentle and silent between them. Weston's gaze was steady, the same calm she had seen on the church porch, and now it held something more, something like an unspoken promise. "Come with us," he said, not demanding, not pleading, just offering. "You'll have work, and you'll have a place. My daughter needs someone kind." Hannah felt her throat tighten again, tears prickling at the edges of her eyes. She looked at Isla's small hand curled around hers, then back at Weston, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the possibility of belonging. The trail to Hollow Ridge wound through a valley of frost-tipped pines, the kind that held their silence close, muffling even the crunch of hooves in the snow. Hannah sat in the wagon beside Weston, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the road that curved ahead. She still wore the ivory dress, though the hem was damp and gray from the slush of town. The handkerchief Weston had given her was tucked into her sleeve, soft against her wrist, a reminder that at least one soul in the world had not joined in laughter. Behind them, the little girl named Isla hummed tunelessly, her curls bobbing as she kicked her boots against the sideboards. Hannah stole glances at her, unsure how to speak, unsure if she ought to at all. The cabin came into view as the afternoon sun slanted low, a solid frame of logs with smoke curling from the chimney, and a barn leaning stubbornly against the wind. Weston pulled the wagon to a stop, climbed down with a quiet ease, and offered a hand to his daughter first. Isla jumped into the snow, her laughter ringing like a bell in the cold air. Then she looked up expectantly as Hannah hesitated on the bench. Weston lifted her down without a word, his grip firm but gentle, and when her boots touched the ground, she realized how long it had been since a man had steadied her with kindness rather than judgment. Inside, the warmth of the fire met them, filling the single room with the smell of wood smoke and stew left to simmer. Hannah moved cautiously, her fingers brushing the rough edges of the table, the shelves lined with tin cups, the single bed tucked against the wall. She felt the walls press close, but not unkindly, as if the place had been waiting for her steps. Weston stoked the fire, setting his hat on a peg, while Isla pulled a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil from a drawer and settled on the floor. Hannah knelt beside her, her skirt spreading over the worn boards. "What are you drawing?" she asked softly, unsure if the child would answer. Isla looked up with a grin, cheeks pink from the fire's heat. "You," she said simply, her small hand scribbling a round face, wide eyes, a dress that trailed too long. Hannah's throat tightened as she watched, her breath catching when Isla held up the crooked picture with pride. "Pretty lady," the girl said again, her voice bright, her eyes without a shadow of doubt. The words struck Hannah, like sunlight breaking through clouds. After weeks of gray, no one had called her that in years, not since James had whispered it in moments she still carried like fragile glass. To hear it now, from a child who had nothing to gain and no reason to flatter, made her eyes sting with sudden tears. She pressed a hand to her lips, trying to steady herself, but Isla only laughed and leaned against her, tucking the drawing into her lap as though it were already true. Weston watched from the hearth, his face unreadable, his hands busy with a length of tack he pretended to mend. Yet his eyes lingered on the two of them, on the way Hannah bent her head toward his daughter, on the way Isla's trust seemed to bloom without hesitation. He said nothing, but when Hannah glanced up, she caught the faintest shift in his gaze, something softer than she expected, something that made her heart stumble in its rhythm. That night, as the fire burned low, Hannah lay on a blanket near the hearth. The wooden comb she carried from her old life rested by her side, but she did not touch it. Instead, she held Isla's drawing close, tracing the crude lines with trembling fingers. "Pretty lady," the child had said, without laughter, without scorn, only belief. For the first time since James's passing, Hannah felt the possibility that she might be more than ridicule, more than whispers behind church pews. She closed her eyes to the crackle of fire, the sound of Weston's boots across the floor, and the gentle breathing of a child who had given her back a piece of herself she thought was lost. The wind that swept across Hollow Ridge carried with it the sharp bite of winter, the kind that slipped through cracks in the cabin walls and made even the fire strain to keep the cold at bay. Hannah woke early, the pale light of dawn just beginning to creep across the floorboards, and she tied her shawl tighter before stepping into the kitchen. Her fingers felt clumsy, stiff from the chill, as she fumbled with the iron pot on the stove. She had never been taught to cook beyond boiling water and stirring broth, but now she tried to make something more, something that might fill the cabin with warmth for Weston and his daughter. The stew hissed when it boiled over, spilling across the stovetop and sending up a bitter smell of burnt onion. Hannah gasped and grabbed a cloth, scrubbing quickly, her heart pounding as though she had broken something precious. It was not the first mistake she had made that week. Only yesterday she had dropped a bowl, shattering it against the floor, and the day before she had made Isla's bed too neat, forgetting the child preferred her quilts in a happy tangle. Each small failure seemed to pile heavier on her shoulders, whispering that she did not belong here, that sooner or later they would see what she already knew. She stirred the stew too fast, and some sloshed over the rim again. Her shoulders tightened with dread at the sound of footsteps on the porch. Weston entered, carrying a tin bucket that steamed in the cold air. He set it down near the stove without looking directly at her. Hannah froze, bracing for the sigh, the frown, the quiet disappointment she had known too well in her past life. Instead, Weston only said, "For washing," his voice steady and without judgment. Hannah blinked, staring at the bucket of warm water. "Thank you," she whispered, though her throat was tight. Weston gave a small nod, nothing more, and stepped back outside, the door closing softly behind him. She stood very still, cloth in hand, realizing he had offered help instead of reproach. No lecture, no cold reminder of her mistakes, just a bucket of warm water. Later, after the supper was eaten in quiet, Isla spread her pencils across the floor, drawing with the same fierce focus she had shown the night before. Hannah knelt beside her, smiling at the crooked shapes of horses and flowers that filled the paper. "You are very focused," she said gently. Isla grinned up at her, her curls tumbling over her shoulders. "It's you," she announced, pointing to the newest picture. Hannah's breath caught as she saw her own round figure drawn with a bright smile on its face. "Pretty lady," Isla said again, the certainty in her voice strong as any hymn. Weston looked up from the tack he was mending, his eyes lingering on the picture, then on Hannah herself. He said nothing, only folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his vest pocket, as though it mattered more than he would ever admit aloud. That night, when Hannah retired to her small room, she found a folded towel at the end of her bed, still warm from the stove, with a single piece of hard candy resting on top. There was no note, no explanation, but she knew whose hand had left it there. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on the simple gift, her fingers brushing over the towel and the candy, as though they were made of gold. No one had ever thanked her this way, not in silence, not without expecting something in return. The cabin creaked under the weight of the wind, but inside, for the first time, Hannah felt steadied. She may have fumbled through her days, her hands clumsy and unsure, but there was kindness here, and it was enough to keep her trying. The morning sky was bright and sharp, the kind of blue that made the cold feel even deeper in the lungs. Frost clung to the fence rails and sparkled over the field where the paddock stretched wide. Hannah had just finished hanging linens when she heard the sound of Isla's laughter ring out, light and unguarded, the sound carrying across the ridge like a bell. She turned quickly, the basket still in her hands, and her heart dropped. Isla had wandered past the fence, her little boots crunching across the stiff grass, straight toward the cluster of unbroken horses that pawed restlessly at the frozen ground. One horse, a silver gray with a mane like wild smoke, tossed its head and reared, hooves cutting at the air. The child stood frozen, her small figure caught between innocence and danger. Hannah's breath caught in her chest. She dropped the basket, apples tumbling into the frost, and without a thought she ran. Her skirts tangled at her knees, the wind biting against her face. But she did not slow. Every beat of her heart pounded with one thought: get to the child. Isla turned at the sound of her name, surprise flickering across her face. But the horse was already charging forward, muscles tight, hooves thundering against the earth. Hannah lunged, her arms wrapping around the girl, turning her back to shield her just as the horse barreled past. The rush of air knocked her breath away. The ground shook beneath them, and dust rose sharp as smoke. She clung tighter to Isla, pulling her down into the snow as the animal veered off with a furious snort, circling back but stopping short at the fence line. Her body trembled with the force of fear, every limb shaking, her breath ragged in the cold. Isla cried into her shoulder, small fists gripping Hannah's dress with desperate strength. Hannah whispered soft words, though her own voice shook, telling her it was all right, that she had her, that nothing would take her away. The pounding of boots came then, heavy and fast, and Weston was suddenly there, sliding to his knees beside them. His coat was dusted with snow, his face pale and drawn. His hands reached out, steady and strong, brushing Isla's curls first, then holding Hannah's arm as if to make sure she was real and whole. His chest heaved with every breath, but his eyes did not waver. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice rough. Hannah shook her head, though her back ached and her knees burned. "She's safe," she whispered, her voice breaking. Weston looked at Isla, then at Hannah, and for a long moment he said nothing. The silence was heavy, filled with all that might have been lost. Isla clung to Hannah still, her cries softening but her small body refusing to let go. Weston's jaw tightened, his gray eyes clouded with something that was not just fear, but gratitude and awe. "You didn't even think," he said quietly, almost to himself. Hannah brushed a tear from Isla's cheek. She was out there alone. "I couldn't stop to think." Weston nodded slowly, his gaze steady on her face. "You could have been trampled," he said. "I didn't care," she answered, her voice soft but firm. The silence that followed carried more than words. Weston reached out, his hand brushing against Hannah's as they both held Isla close. The touch was brief, but it carried the weight of all he could not yet say. Later, when the danger had passed, and the paddock was quiet again, Isla finally released her grip, falling asleep with her head against Hannah's shoulder. Weston watched them both, his heart still unsteady. That night, when Hannah went to her small room, she found a gift waiting on her bed. A comb, hand-carved from wood, polished smooth, with a tiny heart etched into the handle. She picked it up slowly, her fingers tracing the grooves, her throat tightened, her eyes burning, because no one had ever thanked her in silence before. The air in Hollow Ridge carried a bite that morning, the kind that hinted of snow, though the sky still shone bright and blue. Hannah wrapped her shawl tight as she carried a basket back from town, her boots crunching against the packed earth road. She kept her eyes forward, yet the whispers found her anyway. They slipped like knives between the quiet spaces, sharp enough to wound even when not spoken aloud. She had heard them first in the store, hushed voices over burlap sacks of flour. They said she had been run out of Red Valley, that her name was stained by scandal, that she had tried to catch the son of a prominent family and paid for it with her reputation. Hannah had tried to keep her chin high, to let the rumors slide past, but each word pressed against her chest like a stone. When she reached the wagon waiting outside, her fingers trembled against the handle of the basket. She glanced at Weston, but his face was unreadable, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if the gossip were nothing more than dust on the wind. Still, the words clung to her on the ride home. By the time she reached the cabin, her breath felt heavy, her heart tired. She tried to keep busy, scrubbing the stove, folding linens, anything to drown out the echoes of her past. Yet no matter how she worked, the whispers crept back in, reminding her of the girl she once was. The girl who thought she could wear a wedding dress and be proud. The girl who had been laughed out of town. The next day, as she carried apples back from the orchard, a voice stopped her cold. Samuel Price stood leaning against the fence, polished boots gleaming, his coat too fine for the dust of Montana. His smile was sly, his eyes pale and cruel in a way she remembered all too well. "Well, if it isn't the belle of the scandal," he drawled, stepping closer. Hannah froze, the basket trembling in her arms. "Why are you here?" she managed to ask, her voice thin. Samuel clicked his tongue, his smile widening. "I heard whispers about a woman who tried to rise above her station, and I came to see if the rumors were true." His voice dropped low. "I could help you, Hannah. Letters, words in the right ears. I could erase what they say about you." She felt her stomach twist as bile rose in her throat. "In exchange for what?" she asked flatly. He leaned close, his breath warm with arrogance. "For finishing what you started." Her hand moved before her mind caught up. The slap cracked through the air, sharp as a pistol shot. Samuel staggered back, shock flashing across his face. "You lied," Hannah said, her breath shaking. "You ruined me, and now you think I would let you own me again?" A shadow shifted near the barn. Weston stepped forward, arms crossed, his jaw set like stone. "She already does matter," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. Samuel sneered. "This is between us." Weston moved closer, each step heavy, his gray eyes steady. "No," he said. "You made it about the town when you branded her with your lies. You made it mine when you came here thinking she was defenseless." Samuel's nostrils flared. "You don't know what she did." Weston leaned in, his voice low and certain. "I know she wakes before dawn. I know she burns herself trying to make my home warm. I know she threw herself in front of a horse to save my daughter. That is what I know, and it is worth more than your words." Samuel faltered, his face twisting with anger, then turned on his heel. "You'll regret this," he spat. Weston didn't move, his voice flat. "I doubt it." When the sound of Samuel's boots faded, Weston looked at Hannah. Her eyes shimmered, wide and unsure. "You never have to answer for who you were," he told her softly. "Only who you are." That night, Hannah sat on her bed with the wooden comb in her hands, tracing the tiny carved heart again and again. The whispers from the past still lingered, but now they seemed weaker, dulled by the truth of a man who had chosen to see her for what she truly was. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe without shame. The snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting down from a sky the color of pewter. Hollow Ridge lay hushed beneath the weight of it, the fences dusted white, the barn roof sagging under the burden of winter. Inside the cabin, Hannah moved quietly through the kitchen, drying tin cups and stacking them neatly on the shelf. The fire in the hearth crackled, filling the room with a steady warmth, yet her heart felt unsettled. She had been in the Dyer home for weeks, but still the whispers of town followed her like shadows. And though Weston had stood at her side, doubt lingered like a bruise that refused to fade. That evening, as she carried the last cup toward the wash basin, a sound caught her attention. Voices carried faintly from outside, blurred at first by the window pane, then sharp as the wind shifted. She froze, the cup in her hand forgotten, her breath caught as she heard the measured tone of Reverend Emmett. His words slipped through the glass like a knife. "Your daughter needs stability," he said firmly. "A home needs more than a father, Weston. It needs a mother, a proper one, not a woman with a past like hers." Hannah's throat tightened, her fingers trembling so badly she nearly dropped the cup. She dared not move, only listened, each word sinking heavy into her chest. Then came Weston's voice, steady as always, though softer than she had expected. "I don't need another wife," he said. The silence that followed pressed sharp against her ribs. She felt her face go hot, her stomach twist. That was all she was to him. A helper, a placeholder, someone to keep house until he decided otherwise. Reverend Emmett spoke again, his tone almost coaxing. "You're a good man, Weston, but a house should not be kept by a woman like that. Your girl deserves better." Hannah braced herself, waiting for Weston's agreement, waiting for the weight of his disappointment to fall, as it always had with others. But his answer was different. "She has done more than anyone expected," he said plainly. "She has given my daughter more than I could have hoped for. That's all." His voice held no anger, only calm certainty, as though the matter needed no more words. Then footsteps crunched in the snow, fading as the Reverend left, and the silence outside grew deep again. Hannah stood frozen by the window, her chest aching. All, he had said, as though her worth ended where his gratitude began. She placed the cup in the basin, the clatter too loud in the stillness, then pressed her hands hard against the wood counter. Her throat burned, her eyes blurred, but she would not let tears fall where they could be seen. Later, in her small room, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wooden comb Weston had carved for her, the one with the tiny heart etched into its handle. She traced the grooves with her thumb, remembering the warmth it had brought, the way her chest had eased when she first held it. But now the gift felt different, heavy, with meaning she could no longer trust. Was it kindness, or simply duty? Did he see her as part of his home, or only as someone who filled its empty corners? Her shawl lay folded on the chair. Slowly, she rose, gathered it, and placed it into her satchel with a few other belongings. Not everything, just enough to leave quietly. She told herself Isla would forget. Children always did, and Weston would move on. She tried to believe it, but her hands shook as she tied the satchel closed. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, urging her to move quickly, to slip away before the dawn. She opened the door softly, the cold rushing in like a thief, and stepped out into the snow. Behind her the cabin glowed with warm light, but ahead stretched only the dark ridge, and the whisper of a past she could not escape. The wind carried a restless moan across Hollow Ridge that night, rattling loose boards on the barn and sweeping fine needles of snow through the air. The sky was bruised with storm clouds, the moon fighting to break free but smothered by the weight of winter. Hannah tightened her shawl around her shoulders and stepped softly from the cabin, her boots sinking into the crust of snow. Each breath rose in a pale cloud, each step heavier than the last. She did not look back. She could not. If she let herself glance at the warm glow spilling from the cabin windows, she might falter. And faltering now would break her resolve. Her satchel pressed against her side, light but carrying everything she thought she could keep. A few folded garments, the comb Weston had given her, and a piece of chalk she had tucked away long ago. She walked quickly, her skirts brushing against drifts that clung to her hem. The storm had not yet reached its worst, but she could feel it building, the air sharp and thin like glass about to shatter. She told herself that leaving was the only way, that staying meant waiting for the day Weston would tell her she was nothing more than help, a convenience, a shadow passing through his house. Better to go now than to bleed slowly from words unspoken. Behind her, the cabin creaked as if alive, and she imagined Isla stirring in her sleep. The small girl's curls spread across her pillow, her little hand curled around her drawing pad. The memory nearly stopped Hannah in her tracks. Isla's voice echoed in her mind, the simple, bright words that had cut deeper than any cruelty ever could. Pretty lady. She pressed her lips together hard and forced her boots onward. Children forgot quickly, she whispered to herself. In time, Isla would forget her face, her laugh, the way she tucked the quilt too tightly. But even as she told herself that lie, Hannah's chest tightened until each breath felt like breaking glass. Snow thickened, swirling in wild gusts that stung her cheeks and burned her eyes. Her lantern swung wildly in her gloved hand, the light a small, trembling circle against the vast blackness. "Keep moving," she muttered, her voice nearly stolen by the wind. Her feet stumbled over hidden roots, the drifts tugging at her legs, but she pressed on, one step after another. Somewhere in the dark she thought she heard her name, faint and desperate, but she told herself it was only memory, only the echo of voices she would no longer hear once the ridge swallowed her up. Then she stopped, heart thundering. The snow stretched endless before her, but something inside her quaked, a whisper, louder than the storm, a warning that she was not only leaving a cabin or a man, but a child who had clung to her with absolute trust. She dropped to her knees, the satchel falling open, the comb tumbling into the snow. Her hands pressed hard against her face, her breath breaking into sobs she could no longer swallow. For a long moment she stayed there, bent beneath the storm, torn between fear of staying and terror of losing what had begun to feel like home. Far behind her, the cabin door opened, light spilling against the night. A voice called her name, carried ragged on the wind, not sharp with judgment but rough with fear. Lanterns soon bobbed in the distance, others joining, the search already begun. Hannah rose shakily, clutching her satchel, her hair whipped loose around her face. She took a step, then another, not toward the horizon but back into the storm, uncertain if she was running away or being pulled home by something stronger than shame. The ridge lay wrapped in white, the snow heavy and endless, pressing the world into a hush that seemed older than time itself. Lanterns bobbed across the fields, small orbs of gold fighting against the dark, voices calling through the storm, men shouting names into the wind. Weston's voice rose among them, hoarse from cold and fear, carrying not just command, but desperation. He had searched the barn, the pastures, the frozen creek bed, and each place he had not found them tightened the grip on his chest until every breath hurt. His boots sank deep into the drifts as he pressed on, the lantern in his hand trembling, his eyes burning against the snow. Hannah staggered further down the slope, her shawl clutched tight around Isla's small body. She had found the child huddled beneath a pine, her little form curled tight against the cold, and the sight of her had nearly broken her in two. Now she carried her back through the storm, each step a battle, her arms aching, her lungs burning. The lantern she had dropped lay somewhere behind them, swallowed by snow, but she no longer cared. All that mattered was the child pressed against her chest, still breathing, still alive. Isla's small fingers clung to the fabric of her dress with desperate strength, as if afraid Hannah might vanish if she let go. "Shh, sweetheart, I've got you," Hannah whispered, her voice shaking, her words snatched quickly by the wind. "You're safe now. I won't leave you again." The admission cut deep, for she knew it was true. She had thought to disappear quietly, to save herself from the ache of being unwanted. But the moment she saw Isla alone in the snow, every reason to leave had fallen away. A sharp crunch of footsteps came from behind. She turned her head, snow blinding her eyes, and then she saw him. Weston, his coat heavy with frost, his beard rimmed white, his lantern swinging wildly in one hand. He dropped it the instant he reached them, falling to his knees in the snow. His arms wrapped around both of them, crushing them against his chest, as if by sheer strength he could keep the world from tearing them away again. His forehead pressed to Hannah's shoulder, his breath ragged, his voice a broken chant. "Thank God! Thank God!" For a long moment, none of them moved. The storm swirled around them, yet within that circle of arms, the world seemed still, hushed, filled only with the sound of three hearts beating close together. Isla whimpered softly, her little face buried against Hannah's neck, but her sobs began to ease, soothed by the strength holding them. Weston drew back at last, his gray eyes finding Hannah's. There was no hesitation in them, no shadow of doubt, only raw truth. "I never meant what you thought you heard," he said, his voice low, thick with emotion. "I didn't say I didn't want you. I said I didn't need another wife because I already found someone who made this house a home. Someone who gave my daughter back her laughter. Someone who made me remember I could feel again." Hannah's breath caught, her lips parting, but no words came. Her throat burned too hot, her chest too full. Weston reached into his coat with a trembling hand and drew out a small silver ring, worn with years but polished clean. Snow clung to it, yet even in the storm it glinted. He held it between them, his hand steady, despite the cold. "Will you marry me, Hannah? Not because of duty, not because of need, but because I choose you." The storm seemed to pause, the snow falling softer, quieter. Hannah looked at him, at Isla still clinging to her, at the man whose arms held both, as though they were the only treasure left in the world. Tears blurred her sight, but her heart was clear. She nodded, the smallest motion, yet it carried the weight of everything she had once believed lost. Weston closed his eyes, pulling them both against him again, and in the silence of the storm, they were found. Spring came soft to Hollow Ridge, the kind of spring that made the grass shimmer with dew and coaxed blossoms from the stubborn apple trees behind the barn. The valley that once seemed too wide and cold now held the sound of laughter, of footsteps that did not echo in loneliness, but folded into one another like voices in a hymn. Hannah stood at the edge of the new room Weston had built, her hand resting on the frame of the wide window that faced the east. Morning light spilled across the desk, across the shelves already filled with books and scraps of paper, across the comb she had carried through shame and storms. This room was hers, not given out of pity, not left over from someone else's past, but made because she was wanted. The townfolk had begun to speak her name differently. Once it had been whispered sharp and cruel, tied to old rumors and the cruel laughter of a church pew. Now it was said with softer voices, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with a nod of respect. The children who came for lessons called her Miss Hannah, their chalk-stained fingers tugging at her skirts, their eager eyes looking to her as though she had always been their teacher. The women who had once turned their backs now brought baskets of flour or jars of preserves, setting them at her door without asking for anything in return. Men who had mocked her figure once now tipped their hats when she passed, as if they too had seen what Weston and Isla already knew. That beauty was not measured in fabric or shape, but in the way someone's presence filled the silence. One afternoon, as she gathered the children on the porch for their letters, Isla clambered into her lap with a grin wide as the sky. "You're not the fat lady anymore," she declared proudly, her curls bouncing as she spoke. "You're the pretty lady who makes people smile." The other children giggled, but not cruelly, only with the joy of sharing the truth Isla had spoken. Hannah's cheeks warmed, and she bent her head to kiss the girl's crown. The words were clumsy, childlike, but they were truer than any she had carried before. She was not the fat lady who wore her grief like a cloak, not the woman who walked out of a church to laughter, but the one who had been given a new name by the very mouths that once mocked her. That evening, she sat beside Weston under the cottonwood tree, their hands linked, the sound of crickets rising with the dusk. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked quietly, her voice almost lost in the wind. He turned to her, eyes steady, lips pulling into the faintest smile. "I think about how far you've walked since then," he said. "And I think about how lucky I am you stopped walking when you found us." She laughed softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. The world stretched wide before them, but she no longer feared its distance. She had been given a new name, not by the town, not by pity, but by love. If this story touched your heart, if you believe love can rise from laughter meant to wound and turn into something lasting, we invite you to subscribe to Western Love Legends. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and help us keep these stories of the frontier alive. And remember, sometimes all it takes to change a name is one child calling you pretty and refusing to be argued with.